It's time for fun, learning, commentary, laughs, and more. Care of the most diverse group in the genealogy and family history world.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live. Welcome to BlackProGen Live with your hosts, Nika and True, and the baddest panel in these pedigree streets.
BlackProGen.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live.
Alito, chuma.
The unapologetic Black and people of color viewpoint.
Genealogy, family history research with flavor. Hey, y'all. Hey, what's going on? We are doing a pop-up on you. And I literally almost cussed, but I realized we're live. So I'm not going to do it. Hey, y'all. It's been forever. It's a whole summer. It's a whole not dark outside. It's a whole Felicia's got blonde hair now. It's an Andre's got a hat. It is BlackProGen Live with a special episode this evening. Yes, we popped up on you. Doing a little something different because why not? And who's gonna say and whatever. Either way, we are glad you all are joining us this evening. We have quite a bit to talk about because, of course, as always, there's a ton going on in the genealogy world, in the history world, i.e. Florida. We're gonna blame the whole thing on Ellen Fernandez-Sacco because she lives there. I'm kidding. But beyond that, primarily what we're going to be talking about tonight is the recent episode of Radiolab that I had a chance to participate in. And I have to welcome, of course, we have a special guest amongst our panelists, but we're gonna have good home training and welcome our guest first. I'm going to welcome the incomparable Alex Neason, who works for Radiolab and who was a part of the journey. Of course, we took the liberty of using her family history to lead us down lots of things. But welcome, Alex, to BlackProGen Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good. All right. So along with Alex, we've got several people watching live. We've got folks here on Patreon live here in Zoom with us. If you have a question, you want to ask Alex something directly, use the chat, raise your hand. We'll bring you up on video so that you can do that. We also have people watching live on YouTube. So hello to our YouTube folks as well. We have our illustrious panel. We're going to start with I forget, the Blue Ridge Mountains. I think that's what they're called. Shelley says it every time, and I act like I don't know what she's talking about. Hey, Dr. Shelley Murphy.
Bonjour. How are you doing? Glad to be here tonight. Ready for a good conversation.
Good. All right. Then we're going to head a little bit north of her with our gentleman, Jack, with the hat, Andre Farrell.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to see everyone, excited to see friends online and excited about tonight's conversation.
All right. Ellen, we blamed you for the entire fiasco with education in Florida. I apologize. Take responsibility.
I try to tell them, but it's very worrisome, but I'm happy to be here, excited about this discussion tonight. And I think this is really what we should be focusing on.
Look at her always being poignant. Let's go to Felicia. How was it out there in Oakland? And I know we ripped you away from your research because you've been making some hits today.
I'm great. I am great. I am happy in research land. It's my most favorite place to be besides sleep. And I'm having a ball and I'm happy to be here with everybody.
Good. And my co-host, Chuann, girl, did you find your other earring?
Not yet, but it's okay. Y'all family, y'all understand. Hey, it's your girl, True Lewis from My True Roots. You all know I'm down here at the Fort Knox, Kentucky, and it is just so good to see everybody in that chat room. The Patreon folks, I have missed you. I have been busy, but you guys are always on my heart. And I'm just so glad to be here because I can't wait to talk about Miss Alex's story because it just brought back so much for me. and where it's going to go in the future for our community. So I'm just looking forward to you two's conversation.
Hey, good. Well, we got folks from San Antone. I don't know why I feel like I have to say it like that. Why do I have to say it like Ike Turner? Either way, we have people from San Antonio in the house in the chat. We've got our friend in Freedmen's Bureau Fridays, Dana Lee is there, and Dale Colston is joining us. St. Louis is in the house as well. Our buddy Carmen should have been here, but she's someplace. So she's not here. Either way, again, thank you guys for taking time out of your evening to join us. True is going to put some links in the chat for you. If you have not listened to the episode, my God, you're going to be lost in this conversation because we ain't going to rehash. This is not going to be the Cliff Notes. We are not going to sit here and take you through all the things. True is being funny because it took her a month to get through the episode. And it wasn't because it was hard for her to listen to it. It's just people kept interfering with her listening. So she had to constantly go back. And so it was so funny to kind of hear her reactions when she was finally getting to the parts today. So it's fresh for her. So Truth, again, is going to be putting links in the chat. So in addition to the episode, of course, we want to make sure that things are accessible. So Ellen, of course, gave us the link for the transcript. So if you want to read or see if certain terms are used, right? Because here's the best part about the fact that it's audio. I learned so much during this process, but we'll talk about that later. But here's the other part that I love about this is that because we spoke it and it's transcripted, it's now a source. Hear me? It's now a genealogy source. If you didn't think it was a source, it's a source now. So consider what you're putting together. If you're blogging, all that other stuff, consider that stuff to be a source. So she's going to put the link in there. There's a couple ways to listen. You can listen on the Radiolab website. You can also listen on YouTube. Yes, get those streams up. We want to get the views and the counts up, of course, right? Because we want to support. And then we also have an interview that me and Alex did with Allison Stewart of All of It from WNYC, where we talked really high level. But this conversation tonight, in the business world, to level set, we're going full on genealogy with this because there was only so much that we could put in one episode. Okay, like there literally was. And so there's some comments coming in the chat. Linda Badger says the episode was amazing. I felt the many feelings I felt when I learned things about my family on the paternal side. Folks are here in the live Zoom chat doing the most. And of course, before we get into all the questions, this would not be BlackProGen Live if we did not give you episodes to go and do further eating later, right? We're going to give you a plate today, but you guys know that we don't leave you empty-handed and not without something to research or something to look into more later. Even if you were a beginner, for some of you, this may be the first time you've actually watched us live. So if so, welcome. But we're going to delve into subject matter that connects back to the links that True is going to share in the chat. What do I mean? Taking a research trip. That's a big part of the pod, okay? It was big part of it was a research trip. A big part of it were Civil War pensions and what that is and how do you get to those? What are they? What do you find when you get in there? We literally have, I don't even know how there used to be the ad campaign. There's an app for everything. There's literally a BlackProGen Live episode for everything. We talk about newspapers because that was a big part of what we discussed in the podcast. It was for leads for us. We also have a playlist that's specifically for researching the formerly enslaved. How do you get to that information? What do you do once you find a lead? How do you keep going? We have that as well. We also have to talk about the slave trade in Louisiana because Louisiana was a central part of this episode. So there are links galore to all of this stuff. Thank you to the hostess with the mostest, True Ann, for placing those in all the respective places. And so, I'm always assigning homework. You know what? I don't appreciate that, Dante Eubanks. I'm just the best. All right. So the first question, and again, you all feel free to ask whatever you want because we are doing the genealogy deep dive. But the first question, and of course, I have to participate in this because I was the sidekick. What parts of the genealogy process for Alex did you not understand before you started working on this story?
All of it. Before we got started and before I met Nika, my only experience with genealogy research was sort of aimlessly searching on Ancestry. And a few times before, I had signed up for a free, not even for one of the paid accounts, just a free account. And I would just go on there, and really all that I had was my name. And so I would just plug Neason into the search bar and just sort of aimlessly scroll through stuff. And I never really, I didn't have any direction. I didn't know like what I was looking for, what I should be looking for. A couple of times I can remember finding things, sort of like basic documents about like my dad, for example, that would show up in there. But I don't even think I really ever attempted a tree, like actually building a tree beyond my immediate family. I just didn't, it was like I didn't have a map. I didn't know like, what do I do once I have the Ancestry account? So I would say I didn't really understand how to do any of it until I met Nika. And when I was looking for Nika, I was looking for a genealogist, and I kind of pitched the story already. And it had a few conversations with my editor and with Susie Lechtenberg, who was previously our executive producer, and had said to them that exactly that. I don't know really how to do this. So if we're going to do this story, then I need to find a professional. I need somebody who can help me through this. And they said yes, and go find someone. And so I went on Google basically and was like, genealogist. And I don't really remember how exactly I found Nika, but I do remember finding this show, and maybe in some kind of a way ended up on Nika's website. And she was the first person that I reached out to, sent a really weird, vague email. I don't know if you remember this, Nika, but
I remember the vague email.
At Radiolab, everything has to be done on tape. And a big part of how I pitched this story was to include the journey, was to include me sort of like starting at square one and looking for help, finding help, and then sort of embarking on the research process. And so we wanted all of this on tape. So I had to send this email that was sort of like, I can't really tell you what I want to talk to you about, but I want to talk to you. And I also want it to be recorded on mic, possibly for a radio story. And it's lucky for me that Nika is who she is, that she said, okay, and was down for that. I think when you wrote me back, the email said something like, I gave very little away in this email, but I do think I said that it was a story involving family history research in New Orleans. And I think the response that I got was, you had me at New Orleans, or something like that. And then we got on the phone, and it was sort of off to the races from there.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point, though. I think folks think that, especially in this world, when you're consistently looking for family, that the only time people reach out to you is when you have a huge following or you go viral. That there's this misconception that like you have to have this big, gigantic platform. This is not a big, gigantic platform. There are other people who are in genealogy and family history who have way more subscribers, way more followers, way more all of that than I do. I'm not even this close to that. But I think there's something to be said for some sort of the content. And in some ways, I would also argue that Louisiana and Mississippi just do this for me. They just always bring me people. They just always deliver me folks. Even when it's random, I always end up selecting somebody or something from the state of Louisiana or Mississippi, just like Shelley sort of does with Virginia, or maybe Andre does with Maryland. Like it just sort of kind of like comes to you. I don't know if it's like that for the rest of the panel, but so for Alex, you realized early on that you needed someone. It ended up being me. Like, was it because you had already gone on and started to do, what was the hardest part? Because I think for those of us who are steeped in genealogy, we think that everybody just gets it off the bat, but like, where was it where you were like, this is above my pay grade? Because you've been to school for journalism, so you know how to know how to find people. But obviously there's some amount of something. There's a switch. There's something that's not the same.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference I make this joke to people all the time, that, you know, nothing in our lives is private and I can find anybody. And that's mostly true on the internet. And I can find where you live and quite easily, phone numbers, addresses. It's like a little disturbing how much of our information is just sort of out there. The difference here, I think, was that we're kind of twofold. In a journalistic context, or at least in a journalistic context that I was used to, when it was time for me to like find someone that I wanted to talk to for a story, I had a name. So there was like a person and I knew that they existed. I just didn't know where they were. And so I could go, I had something to work with and could go and look for and find them. So for this, there were a lot of people who I thought maybe existed or I hoped existed, but the sort of the core of this story, particularly at the beginning when I first pitched it, was there was like an unknown person. There was a name that I could not explain and that no one in my family could explain. There was, and then pretty quickly, there was this sort of ghost that materialized where there was a guy who some people thought existed and some people didn't. And I think that was the big difference, that I wasn't starting with like a list of sources and say, I know that these people are alive or were alive, and I can go and maybe I have some piece of information about like where they lived. But for this, I was dealing with a lot of people who were not living. That was another big difference. And I think the biggest thing was just that I was starting from like less than scratch, really. You know, I was sort of like, there have to be people because I'm here, and people had to exist for me to exist. But I had otherwise no information about who those people were, or where they might be, or what their names were. And so I think I was very disoriented, because when I don't have a name, when there's not like a real person whose life has shape in front of me that I can then go and, you know, research and interview and stuff, I was sort of like, how do I even do this?
Andre, go ahead and say what you typed in the chat. I think that's this very important point.
Well, for you, Alex, it was the funeral program. Like, you're literally looking at this funeral program and you like, who he Harpo?
Yes.
Like, who's this man? The math ain't mathing, and I'm trying to understand why I see this name that shouldn't even be here. And so as you're explaining like the pitch part, I'm thinking back to your interview of you're at your grandfather's funeral and you're like, what? What? This isn't adding up. Like,
yeah.
Your father's funeral, excuse me. Like this is, and so hearing you talk about like the pitch part, I'm going back to the fact that you're at a funeral, you get the funeral program, and you're like, you have an expectation of, I'm expecting to see certain things, and you don't.
And pretty quickly, I mean, that was like, you know, the first, you know, that SpongeBob meme where he's like spinning, that was like the first of many, many moments like that. But even from there, you know, I pitched the story after that moment. Like my parents actually went to the funeral. I wasn't at the funeral. My dad brought this program back for me because I just keep things like that. So they bring me a program back. And then I start to read it finally, and I see this name that I can't explain. And so I start asking questions, and it turns out a lot of people can't explain it. And actually, when I first pitched the story that I pitched was that, because the first person that I called I think probably the first person I called was my dad. And the second person that I called was his older sister, my Aunt Cheryl, who appears in the story. And she told me what she knew, or what she thought she knew, which was that Wilson Howard, she sort of seeded a story in my head that Wilson Howard was not the biological father, and she couldn't explain like the Howard, and then she didn't know where Neason came from, but she was like, well, he's not the bio dad, he's just the dad who raised him. And then I started asking other people, my dad's other sisters, and I was hearing different things. a different aunt said, well, actually Wilson Howard is the biological dad. And so pretty quickly I came across something that Nika would later tell me is super common, which was just that kind of what I saw in the chat, the limits of generational memory, that people in my immediate, like fairly immediate family tree just did not agree about who was who and why. So I remember when I first pitched the story, I pitched a story that was sort of like, let's find, like, I want to find out who my biological great-grandfather, sorry, is, and where did we get this name from, and why did we get this name? And then immediately started talking to people, and the shape of the story just became this big blob. Like, it just immediately started to change with every phone call every conversation that I had with everyone. It was like I would hang up the phone and sort of look at my notes like, I don't know what's going on. And nobody else seems to know what's going on either. So yeah, it was sort of like, I don't know, I get for that moment with the funeral program, I had never really, it seems silly in retrospect, but I had never really considered that a funeral program could just be wrong or that the funeral program is written by a person and people are wrong about stuff all the time. And I don't know, I just had always thought of these documents as absolute, as if it's in there, it must be true. So when I had that first moment where clearly it was either not true or it wasn't the whole story because it was not matching what people thought in their heads. That was sort of one of the first moments where my idea about a document as being God, which is a thing in journalism that is sort of what we live by, is like the documents support the story. And that got totally blown up.
That was a whole sermon. I don't know if y'all really understood that whole sermon. That she just, I need the panel to weigh in, because the whole concept of the document is God. We could sit here for the next 3 hours and pick that apart in genealogy, especially when we're talking about people of color and the fact that who created the document dictates who God is. I'm not getting enough reaction from you all.
I get you, because I can see myself right now, and when I'm talking to mommy and daddy back in the early 2000s, and you like, wait a minute now. You just go there with that document and those who wrote it, and this can't be right. When she went through that part, everything she was going through, we'll talk later on as well, but I was going through my first time with Alex. Like, she was taking me what I saw that first time I was at the courthouse, when we was, this name does not match, but wait a minute, is he really, I went through all the emotions that she did. I just really allowed myself to go back there. That's just the best way I can put it.
Any other feedback from the panel so far?
I don't know how to discuss documents. I mean, I can't go to the bank and cash it. It's just got to be something else. Yeah.
Ooh,
yeah.
All the quotables.
That should be on a t-shirt.
Right.
But yeah, there's just so many things that possibilities or inaccuracy, because we also don't know who gave the information necessarily. And then some of our folks might have the mark and not a signature. Who's really on their behalf helping them, just down to the basic census. Who gave the information? Was it the kid next door, or was it the wife or the sister living in a house and it looks like it's a husband and a wife? And it's all, I'm constantly making myself check that, because I make too many assumptions just looking off of a simple census. And when I get checked, then I had to make myself stop doing that, but I had to learn that. And just like True, I felt that, because I thought, oh yeah, wait a minute, who gave this information? That doesn't even sound right, or even down to the spelling, because people listening. So yeah, I'm weary of documents. It doesn't matter where it comes from, because we did not have control.
Ellen, I feel like you have something profound to say. Don't ask me why I know that.
No, what I really, really loved about it was that sense of time, and then trying to find the person who knew something. And then you start to realize that this generational memory, the stuff that we tell each other from generation to generation, that keeps us going in terms of what we know about family or whatever, it shifts. And you start to notice with the documents, man, this is starting to go like this. This is morphing into something else. So I was really curious, the woman that you finally hooked up with, who finally remembered what the tea was from back then, that was so fascinating. And I remember it's that thing you go through when you start searching for that ancestor and you want to find something concrete, somebody that could tell you something, and not a piece of paper where they're just a trace. There's so much. A paper is it's like a sieve. There's just only so much that's in there, that's through that life. But then through these fragments, we just keep, I don't know, lacing it together, crocheting it together, weaving it together, making a quilt, just to get some kind of story, because that's for us now. They're gone, but I applaud that search. And it just brings you back, just like True said, you go through that whole process and you remember, I can't find this. I can't find this person. Am I ever going to find this person? And sometimes it's so long. It could take decades sometimes. And all of a sudden, like what happened with Felicia, when you look at 7 years, Felicia, and all of a sudden tonight, of all nights, you got that knock on the door,
Of all nights. And when I said 7 years, I kind of went over my notes, because I do take notes. And actually, it's been more like 9 years that I have been looking for this third great set of grandparents. I knew, somewhere they had to exist. I've searched every place. And then I found them, of course, with new records that have now been, indexed and all of that, and it's available online. My plan was to come to Virginia and say, hey, Shelley, let's go over here to Pennsylvania, and we're going to sit here and figure this out, because the documents, they tell a story. Sometimes they tell the truth. That's the way I look at it. Sometimes they tell the truth. And it took me a long time to figure that out, because in the beginning, it was just paper. And I was taking everything in and calling it law. No. It tells a story. It's just not always the truth.
There was a really interesting rearrangement that happened in my brain of I think about it as the order of operations for a math problem, because when I first met Nika, I know once Nika was in, she was like, okay, let's do this. And for our first conversations, and I was like, great. So what do I do? What's step one? And I was like, walk me through what the process was. And in my head, and also this was sort of reflected in those previous attempts of mine where I would just sort of go on Ancestry, and I was just thinking I was going to pull up a bunch of documents that were going to reveal something to me. And so when we actually first got started, and Nika was like, oh, you have to talk to people first. And I was like, huh? She had me do the thing where I filled in as much as I knew from the family tree, but she was like, you have to do family interviews, and that's your actual first step. And it was a real lesson in sort of rearranging the weight that I put on sources as what's the most important source, who are the most important sources, or where am I likely to find the most information. And I think especially for me, because when I was making those first phone calls, before I was thinking about this as a story for Radiolab, when I was just calling people, I think I sort of walked away. I was backing away from the idea of family interviews, because I was so confused after all of these phone calls, and I was hearing such conflicting information. And I was like, nobody knows anything. No one knows what they're talking about. I don't even know what I'm talking about. And I was thinking that documents were going to provide clarity, and they did the opposite much of the time. And so when Nika was sort of like, this is your step one, is like, you have to realize that like the people in your family are valuable, the most valuable sources of information. And that took a lot of like coaching and pep talks from Nika, because I've interviewed lots of people about a lot of different things, including like very personal, sometimes traumatic things, but something just was different about calling someone in my family, about calling my dad and saying, I'm going to send a producer to your house and they're going to stick a mic in your face, and then we're going to have a conversation that is recorded, that's then going to be privy to not just the whole Radiolab staff, the whole production team that's going to work on this, but also, if it makes it into the final piece, anybody who just clicks on Radiolab to listen to this. And that was like very difficult for me. And I was like putting these interviews off as long as possible because I was just like nervous about it. So yeah, it was like, and now coming out on the other side of that, for stories like this, I don't know, there's just been this sort of like, my perspective has sort of shifted like 10 inches to a different direction, away from documents as, you know, all knowing.
And I think the conversation definitely is steering in the direction of like, I think when you initially pitched this, I think you and everyone thought we could solve this online because everything is there. But like, at what point did you realize we were going to have to take that reporting trip, which is definitely seared in my memory for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of searing of that trip for me. But like, when did you realize again that we were not going to be able to stay on, you know, recording on a computer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if there was like a particular day or a moment. I do think it was once I got through the family interviews, and we spent, you know, what must have been like a couple of months, once a week, sometimes more than that, sort of doing these roundups where we'd get on Zoom just like this and talk about what the findings of that week and kind of look through documents and stuff together. And often, I mean, I think a lot of the time, I was like genuinely, because I didn't know my way around any of these databases. I mean, Nika just introduced me to so much more than just what's on Ancestry, that I had no idea existed and wouldn't have even known to like look for. Like, I didn't have the language in my head to even do like a Google search to find any of these other sort of databases. And I guess if there was like a moment, it might have been once we got sometime like in the summer last year, once we started, once we figured out that, once we learned about Levi, I think for me, it was sort of less about, I mean, part of this was not everything is online. Sometimes what we were looking at were indexes and not like full things. I had such a hard time reading things. I could basically read nothing. And so it was like very humbling to have a document and send it to Nika and be like, can you just read it to me? Because I don't know what's going on. So part of it was just like what's online was limited, but I think it was like, once we got to Levi in the tree, there was sort of like a feeling of looking at the documents by themselves in isolation felt out of context of place, because I mean, Louisiana and New Orleans in particular is a place, and just looking at documents about people and their lives and not being in that place where they actually were, you know, that just wasn't like, we weren't going to be able to make the kind of stories that Radiolab makes without going there. So I think it was probably a combination of there's stuff that's in courthouses that is probably there, but we don't know it's there. And so we just have to go and like run some very like cast a wide net, and we're going to have to actually look for stuff, as opposed to some of the searching that we were doing online where we were looking for specific things, where Nika was showing up to our meetings and saying, we're going to look for death certificates for these people. We're going to look for marriage licenses for these particular people. And part of my learning was like, there's stuff that's going to be useful for us that we're not going to know is there until we know it's there. And so for that, we have to go and pull these big old books out and stick them on the table and flip through them. But a big motivation for me was also just about like New Orleans is a place that has so much texture. And I had all of these like childhood memories of going there to visit my family, and none of that was going to be able to be captured just by looking at documents online or even just by calling people and talking to them. And so at some point in the summer, I remember even my editor kind of starting to push me towards that. And I was nervous about doing that too, because I've taken a lot of reporting trips before, but this trip was the first time that I had taken like a joint reporting trip where I had gone somewhere to report a story out where it wasn't just me. I was very like, I've been working in radio a couple of years now, but prior to this, I was a magazine writer. It's a very isolating experience. And when I was taking reporting trips to write these long 7,000 word magazine pieces, I was interviewing a lot of people, spending a lot of time with people, but I was traveling alone. Like I went to a place and my editor stayed at home and I did the reporting and took all the notes and did all the interviews and recorded all the stuff. And then I went home and sort of like went into the bat cave and wrote the story. And it's very isolating. And this was the total opposite of that from the beginning, even when we were just working digitally. And so, going down there, it was me and Nika and also Annie McEwen who produced the piece, the three of us sort of working as a team, like a little crew. And that was totally new for me as well. But yeah, I think that the story was not going to feel of New Orleans unless we went to New Orleans. And it was really important to me that this story feel like it was of this place.
Myself off mute. I would say, yeah, like once she was like, we're going, it was, let's go. Y'all, anybody knows me knows you will never have to beg me to go to New Orleans in life. What I personally loved about it, or Felicia too, right? What I personally loved about it was that it didn't feel like I was going to New Orleans with somebody who ain't never been nowhere. As my mom would say, she act like she ain't never been no place. No, me and Alex knew where all the things were. We had a whole rhythm. It was like, the second generation who wasn't born here. That's what it felt like. And it didn't feel like it was odd. I feel like we were both being like Lonely Planet or Frommers for Annie, because Annie had never been there. So that part was extremely fun. And for me, I think I've mentioned this to you all before. It was a complete full circle moment for me. I remember when I printed out all the stuff for us to like take to the courthouse so we could write all of our notes down. And Alex and Annie were like, oh my gosh, she's prepared. And I'm like, because this is my jam. I'm on the ones and twos with this, going to the courthouse. Let's go. Like, let's get all the information. Let's go and smell the musty books. Let's go and try to read the handwriting. Like, yes, like I've been doing these for so long. And it was good to go to parishes I hadn't been to before. That was the other part. And yeah, it was, oh my gosh, I can't even put into words. I feel like I want to sort of segue into some of the records and stuff that didn't make it into the episode because there's so much. I don't even think like, oh my gosh, the pension was 11th hour. I don't know if you all realize that, but that Civil War pension was 11th hour. And not only was it 11th hour, but the person who got it for us, like, is a cousin of mine who is researching St. Bernard Parish and is pulling all the pensions from all the USTT from St. Bernard Parish. And I mentioned to him that I was working on this project for someone in St. Bernard Parish. And he's like, oh, I requested that file too. And I'm like, all right, well, whoever gets it first, we'll send it. And he got it before I did. And I remember when I got it, I think it was like a Sunday night or like a Saturday night. And I text Alex and I was like, it's with all these exclamation points. And I was like, I'm not going to bed. I'm not going to bed. It was like 11 o'clock at night. And I was like, oh Lord. And I remember I was literally in my pajamas, like with the iPad, like scrolling, like, come on, it's gotta be in here. And I'm like, it's in here. Like, we didn't even get to talk about the dad. We didn't talk about Prince. Like, we sort of talked about Prince, but we didn't get to talk about Prince. The fact that Prince was in the pension, that Levi had more affidavits than I've ever seen in a pension file. He was interviewed like he was interviewed more than 10 times in one pension. There was that. There was the fact that like just learning that for East Louisiana Parish, what's online in terms of what Ancestry has and what Family Search has, those are succession auctions. They're not the actual successions. So if you go search online and you think, oh, well, they must have not had a succession or a probate, that's not true. You're only looking at the auctions. So when we got to the courthouse, and I think I did mention this to Alex, I said, we're going to find what we're looking for in the last hour. I think I mentioned that to her, and that's exactly what happened, because every research trip ends like that. Am I lying? I see a lot of head nodding. So
I complained about that courthouse lady. That's like my
she talked to me
about that lady.
Listen, look, Alex, True was in her feelings. We're talking about the courthouse lady. She was mad. She was like, hey, at first she thought Annie was the courthouse. I was like, Annie was the courthouse lady, and she was like, oh, because I was mad.
That was a whole day. I mean, there's just it's interesting because the story, I mean, it's a lot to ask someone to listen to an hour-long podcast. And we packed so much into that hour, and there was still so much, not just the documents, and Nika is right, like the pension file. I mean, do we even mention Viney's pension file, which
I don't even think we mentioned. So here's the other thing. So I got to backtrack for just a second. When we find Levi's in the Civil War, I need you all to understand that really happened live. That was not us going back. None of the stuff that we did, we had to go back and re-say or re-emote. There was no performance. This was all live.
That was all the hollering that I was jumping and hollering right with you.
The whole holler. It really was, because that's exactly what happened. And so the thing is, Levi's name, it was Chopped and Screwed. That's what I'm just gonna call it. It was Chopped and Screwed. And I saw his pension and I saw Viney's, and then we ended up getting it. And we didn't even talk about the fact that we talked about her applying for the pension, but we didn't really talk about how her Levi's sister wrote these letters on her behalf in the pension. And and I'm like, oh my gosh, because I do not envy Annie or whoever had to edit, because it was we gave you filet mignon, a lobster, an open bar, cheddar bay biscuits, because we Black. We gave you all of that in one meal in 1 hour.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Annie. Andre was asking what Annie's perspective is. We're gonna let Annie be in motherly heaven.
Yeah,
her baby.
Annie had a baby recently, so she's now on maternity leave. But Annie and I talked about this a lot through kind of really from the beginning. Once the story got greenlit, I pitched it, I had all the conversations and got the okay, like run with it. And often that's when a conversation happens about who's going to produce the piece. And Radiolab is like not really that big of a staff in terms of producers, and Annie was the person who I knew that I wanted, and I sort of went into that meeting ready to like argue why we needed to pull her off of whatever she was working on to put her on this. And luckily my editor and I were on the same page, and she was sort of like the obvious choice. But she and I did have a lot of conversations once that assignment was made. I think that Annie was sort of like, I think she was really nervous about a story like this. One, because it's just a hard thing to produce such a personal piece for someone else. I don't have the production chops to have done what Annie did for this story, which is why someone else had to produce this. And like, I don't do sound design. I can't write music. Annie does all of that.
Wait, listen, can we talk about the sound designers? Because baby, listen, I cannot listen. I text Alex because I listened to another podcast right not long after ours came out, and I was like, oh, boo, boo. Like, I have been exposed to caviar. I've been exposed to designer shoes of podcasts. And now I'm serious. It's the layering. Like, I'm like, how the heck? Because I know how to edit sound. And I'm like, how did they layer this? Like when you got to the interview part and they had all the voices, the competing voices. And I was like, how the hell did they do this? And y'all, I was there for it. And I'm asking the question. It's like when we did Hawkins and I was trying to figure out how they took that strip of lights out the car. Ain't nobody told me, or actually, no, Rashidi did tell me how to strip the lights out of the car. But it was just audibly, it was juicy. There's no other way I can describe it. It was just juicy. The sound design was, I'm sorry, I had to stop you to say that. The sound design, it makes you, again, you now have elevated tastes as a result of listening to Radiolab.
Yeah, the Pro Tools session, I remember this from when I first started working at Radiolab too, looking at what a Pro Tools session for any Radiolab episode looks like. It's absolutely chaotic. And it's such a talent. It's like a gift, really, like what our senior producers and sound designers can do. It's just like a zillion tracks, so much audio. And this story was actually in some ways technically complicated because we had so much field tape. Every story is different, but it is not always the case that a story ends up having so many what we call two ways, which are just like basic interviews, two people, sometimes three. Field tape is not unusual, but we had a lot of it. And I didn't know this really until after we got back from New Orleans, but a typical reporting trip for a Radiolab story is like 2 or 3 days. We were in New Orleans for a week doing stuff all day, every day of that week that we were there, with the mics constantly running. Annie was using 2 mics. There were some moments where we weren't using mics and we were using like voice memos on our phones because we were going to get kicked out with our
listen, there were times we were going to get kicked out.
Kicked out of places. And so we had to be a little more discreet. And so there was voice memo audio. There was 2 mics, 2 separate kits. It was just sort of technically complicated. And then you have to put all of that into a session, combine it with all of the 2-way interviews on top of the Zoom record, like Riverside recorded stuff that Nika and I had been doing for months. There was just an enormous amount of tape for this story, a huge amount of tape. So it was really a feat what Annie and then later Dylan, who's our director of sound design, who also worked on this, were able to do. And sort of on top of that, on top of the technical complications, I think for Annie, a lot of the early conversations that we had, there was a lot of getting her caught up to speed. For months, it was just Nika and I working on this. And we would have these check-ins sometimes with Soren Wheeler, who's was my editor. But a lot of this, it was just me and Nika, like in our own little family people world. And Annie was we knew that Annie was going to be the one to produce this, but Annie wasn't really onboarded into the story until I think shortly before we left to go to New Orleans. And that was sort of, it's like a whole other feat. Like, how do we get her caught up to speed for this thing that we've gone so far down into the rabbit hole on for so many months, and we need Annie to be fluent in it before we get down there, so she knows what's going on. It was a lot of names. We had like our own shorthand, really. We were calling a whole character senior, and everyone's like, what does that even mean? So it was a real thing. And I think all of that was there sort of in the room. And then there was also like, Annie is white, Annie is Canadian. We had a lot of conversations about just this. I think she was like nervous about doing right by a story that is not her experience. That is quite far from her experience. And so she and I talked a lot about this. And I wanted Annie on this story because, and Nika knows this now, Annie has like a very tender heart. And I felt like, despite that gap of personal experience, despite the ways that Annie would kind of talk about feeling like there were gaps in her understanding of this history generally, that was, that was sort of making her feel like there's like work I need to do before I can work on something like this and do right by it. And so we had a bunch of conversations about that, but I think one of the reasons that I was confident that we could get there in the time that we had to get there, was because of, having watched Annie work on other stories that are what I call like heart stories. And just sort of watching her navigate those things that were topically very, very different. But stories that sort of like require heart and that are sort of born in a heart, somebody's heart. And that was why I sort of was really confident, that Annie was the right person to work on this with us. But yeah, I think it was like, I think it was overwhelming for all of us in like different ways, sometimes in ways where we were sort of like sharing overwhelm. And then other times I think it was overwhelming for like very distinct reasons for each of us. But yeah, I think it was like, I mean, I pitched this story when I had barely worked at Radiolab for a year. And so I didn't have like very personal relationships with people on staff, certainly not with Annie. I started working at Radiolab post-COVID, like after COVID had already started. So I started totally remote, and I had probably even only met Annie a couple of times in person by the time we started working on this. And so once we were working on it, I mean, the kind of relationship that you build with a person when you're working on something this intensely and for this long is very special and very unique. And it's not every story allows for that. And I think it was required really for us to be sort of thrown into this thing together real deep for a really long time. And I think if we had done this on a different timeline, that the end product would have been dramatically different.
I agree 110%. Because I've worked on stuff where people, it's got to be done in 4 weeks. And this genealogy, if it's done well, it takes time to bake. Mm-hmm. We were on 250 for a long time.
Yes.
We were on 250 for a bit. We totally were. There's some great comments in the chat here. True says, she said, I'm so glad y'all got that to experience that together. As family historians, a lot of what you all did together is still a dream for some of us. We have been working alone in these research trips to our ancestral locations. That's extremely true. Andre said his favorite part or favorite quote was, "I'm getting rid of my bunion." Ellen says she liked the sound design was rich, and so did True. True said, I didn't get your take on how all the producing and editing sound, how you experience knowing that what we have to work out in our streets. And Ellen says she loved the sucking sound of the earth walking through the cemetery. I cannot explain to you all. I can't even properly contextualize our cemetery experiences, because I think we went to 3 and did we go to 3 in one day or
3 cemeteries?
Yeah, because
day.
Right, it was the first day, y'all. It was Labor Day. We went to 3 cemeteries on Labor Day. We didn't think nobody was going to be out there, and then the men are out there with a push mower,
At noon.
Push mower.
High noon.
Yes, at noon, wet ground in the middle of St. Bernard Parish. And oh my gosh, we didn't even really get into, that was the other part that I really wish we if we would have had more time. Just when we got to Chalmette, to the cemetery. And for me, that was very much like hallowed ground, because that's where Levi was buried. So we went to literally see his headstone, and Alice got to sit there and just have her moment. That's the other thing I think I want folks to also realize about when we put these sort of things together, is that if they're done correctly, the person who was experiencing it is allowed to have their moments. There is no rushing through. We got to hurry up and get this because of so-and-so. No, you have to give the people time to process. And I remember Alex was over there and the grass was so impeccable at Chalmette. Like it was just, I don't know what they do there, but oh, it was just impeccable. And I remember going, wait a minute, the Freedmen's Bureau Cemetery is here. And so I went, and it's the only one. I've never found another Freedmen's Bureau cemetery in terms of any of the records that I've ever come across for the Freedmen's Bureau. The only one that I know that has burials and a register of burials is the one in Chalmette. So at least we know who is buried there. So I walked over there and I was like, oh my gosh, there's no headstones. All there is the park bench, but there's a sign, but we know who's here. And so it was that, oh my gosh, that whole moment was so beautiful. And all the unknown soldiers, we have no idea who the heck they are. All of those headstones, oh my gosh, I could just go on and on forever. But I think the number one question I always get from people, did you guys use DNA? Wouldn't DNA give you the answer that you need?
Okay, so what's funny about that is that's another thing that at the beginning of this, I came in like, so the documents are going to be the story and then it's going to be DNA. And Nika was like, kind of, but like move that to the bottom of your list. And there's all this other stuff that's going to happen first. But to answer that question, yes, I did take a DNA test. And I think I took it at some point in the summer. We didn't do the DNA testing right away. But at some point I did get a kit and, swabbed my nose and sent it off, and those results came back. And it was a big question when we were when we got back from New Orleans. It was a big question that me and Annie kind of puzzled over for a really long time, trying to figure out what role the results from the DNA test would play in the construction of the story. Like, at what point do we introduce this? At what point do we look at the results? What do the results even tell us? And I remember, like, I even took the DNA test on Mike. Like, there was, I did it just at home in the other room is where my office setup is with my mic. And, I was like spitting into that little tube into the mic. It sounds disgusting, like hearing the tape, but it was in the draft for a while. There was a version of this story where you hear me spitting into the tube and like singing while I'm like reading the instructions and stuff. Once we got the results were, in my head, there's just this idea about DNA that I had in my head that you just get the results and it's just an answer there. And when we got the results, I remember Nika and I getting on Riverside like we do, opening up Ancestry and sort of looking at all the matches and starting to go through the matches. And Nika had taught me like a way to categorize them, separating all of my like maternal side away so we could just focus on the paternal side, looking for people who we expected to see there, some people who I knew had already tested, and then what to do about like all of these people that were just sort of showing up. And I didn't know, the unit of measurement that's used for DNA. I was sort of like, what's a big number in this context and what's a small number? Like, what is significant and what isn't? So there was a whole lesson in that. And really, we went through it. And then for like weeks, we were just sort of monitoring it. And there was never like a smoking gun. There was never an obvious answer. We did find through the DNA test, and this none of this actually ended up making it into the story. But through the matches, I found a woman named Sabrina Thomas. And it's interesting. I think I probably by myself would have overlooked her. She doesn't live in Louisiana. She doesn't live in New Orleans or Louisiana at all. She lives in Killeen, Texas. Her surname is Thomas. It wasn't a surname that had come up. By that time, the tree had ballooned. It was so big. And so there were more than just Neasons and Howards on the tree, but Thomas was not a name that had come up at all really in our search. And I think I would have overlooked her. But Nika flagged her and was like, this person, I don't remember what the number was, but this person was like statistically significant. So let's look into her. And so we found her in Texas, and I ended up calling her and eventually interviewing her. And she didn't know too much, but through my conversation with her, she was super down to talk. And honestly, she had a whole story. She told me a lot of stories about people who are like maybe my distant relatives, really fascinating stuff, where we were just like sort of an hour into this conversation. We weren't even talking about Neason stuff anymore. We were talking about just like her life. But through her, you know, at the end of that conversation, she was kind of like, I don't know, there's a lot of things where she was the answer to my question from her was, I'm not sure, I just don't know. But she did say to me, I have an aunt, she lives in New Orleans. Her name is Nancy Richard. Richard was a surname that we had come across in building the tree. And she said she knows more and she might know something. So I remember calling Nika and saying, there's this aunt, she's in New Orleans. And we sort of figured out that actually on the tree, Nancy was closer to me on the tree than Sabrina was. And so we said, okay, we should call her. And that took some time as well. Sabrina introduced me to Nancy, and it was similar to with Rhea, who was my, I don't know exactly who Rhea is to me. I just call her my cousin. She's my grandfather's cousin. But it was similar in my hunt for Rhea, where it was for a while, it was sort of a dead end. I remember having one conversation with Sabrina Thomas on the phone and like on three-way with Nancy. That was like an introduction. And I explained who I was and what I was working on. And we kind of talked and figured out that I think it was Nancy's mother was a brother to Wilson Howard. And, you know, we were and I was asking her all these questions. I was throwing names at her, like, do you know this person? Do you know this person? And it took some time, but eventually Nancy agreed to take a DNA test. And I think what it was, Nika, and correct me if I'm misremembering this, but I think the reason we wanted Nancy to take a DNA test, one, she was just closer to me, it would have been like a stronger match if we're related. And also what we learned in some of the other parts of our research was that the Howards and my Neasons and then the other Neasons that we found were all living in like extremely close proximity to each other in the same communities, in some instances like the same blocks, like they were on the same page of the census. They all lived really close to each other. And because of that, and this is another thing that just would not have occurred to me when you were considering these like sort of very distant matches through DNA, Nika was like, there's a chance that these are people who were like very, very, very distant relatives and didn't know it. And people get married and they have kids and they're all from the same communities. And so this is not incest in any modern definition of that word. But it's possible that people are showing up on your list of matches as genetically related to you who are not people we would ever like modernly consider relatives. And I think Sabrina fell into that category where it was like, maybe, but it would be better if we got her aunt to test because it would offer a stronger match if it's a match. And that's why we wanted Nancy to take the test. And eventually I convinced her. And so I bought the kit and I sent it to her. And it was like, I think honestly, it might've taken like 2 months before Nancy actually took the test. She had to get her granddaughter to help her. I remember her telling me, and like, I was just, this is like the work, right? Like I send the text messages, I stayed in touch with her, I was making the phone calls, and you know, answering the questions that she had, and eventually she did take the test kit and send it off. But even then, she sent that test kit off, and by then I think we were into the new year, and every day I would just go on Ancestry and check, and I'm just scrolling to see if she would show up. And by the time we published this story, Nancy had never shown up as a match for me. So we never really came to a conclusive answer on the DNA side. What was significant to me is that by the time I got to that moment where Nancy took the test, and I was checking regularly to see if she showed up, DNA had already like DNA had exited the chat in terms of like the storyboard and its significance to me personally. I think at the beginning of this, I was real caught up in biology. And I was looking for a biological answer, science to like prove that I'm supposed to be a Neason or that I wasn't supposed to be a Neason. And by the time I met Nancy, and by the time she took that test and I was waiting on her results, it just mattered way less to me. It was sort of an idle curiosity. And it was an obvious question that like a lot of people were asking, you know, people in my family, my dad, who I had been sort of keeping updated as I was working on this, they would ask me. But at the beginning, that felt like the golden ticket. And at the end, I was like, even if it comes back and says, yeah, Howard was your bio great granddad, and so your name should technically be Howard, at least by Western patriarchal like naming conventions. Even if that had happened, it didn't, but even if that had happened, you know, it just didn't matter to me anymore. I think my conception of who I am and what the right name is had totally changed by the time we got around to looking for Nancy's DNA test results.
And then the other thing too is that we had to like literally drill down on the Neason side to find somebody to test. And there were like 2 people.
Well, that's a whole other thing. Sometimes I forget like little like
right.
factors of this experience that didn't make it into the story.
Right, like I'm like yes, because people were non-responsive. Then they would finally call us back when we finally got to Louisiana, and so yeah, like there were literally only 2 people that we could test to even validate whether it's like Neason, it's actually Neason or not. And then they just didn't follow through.
Yeah,
but
there was also like to that point. While we were chasing down Neasons to test and ultimately we're not able to, I mean, I did find someone who could test and I did send them a kit, but they didn't actually take the test. But while we were doing that, I ended up meeting someone, it was Leonella. Nurse was her married name, and Neason was her maiden name. And I can't remember at this moment, like how she was related to Senior. She didn't know him personally. She's quite elderly. I ended up talking to her daughter, and in having a conversation with this woman's daughter, found out that she had been in the same middle school class as one of my aunts in junior high of one of my dad's youngest sisters. And so just such weird things like the overlap of Neasons and Howards and the other Neasons throughout this whole thing, from Neasons and Howards living on the same blocks, from people like one lived down the street from someone else's brother, and then to this more modern sort of meshing. It was just very these very like uncanny similarities, and I don't know, it was very strange.
I agree. I would say we got a couple other questions. I think what is the feedback we've gotten since the podcast was released? I've had people ask me that as well. You talk about the emails.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback has been like overwhelmingly positive. I think Nika and I did a couple of interviews, Allison Stewart and a couple of others, to talk about this right after it came out. And in some of those interviews, listeners would call in and kind of talk. I think what has been very endearing to me has just been like, I don't know, it's like I know that people are interested in genealogy I knew that in sort of an abstract way, but the story came out, people listened to it, and then we would go and sit in someone else's chair to talk about it. And to hear people call in and just talk about how, I mean, we had people call in and say things like they had attempted to do this years ago and were kind of in the same place that I was from my starting point. I don't really know how to do this and I want to do this, but I don't know how. And so you just kind of give up on it. Or people who also, like me, when I was younger, had sort of been fed this idea that for Black people in this country, like this information is unknowable, that it's just lost and that we should just let it go, basically. And to hear them say that listening to this podcast was sort of like a map for them and just like inspired them to pick it back up again, to try again. And that I thought was really meaningful. And I mean, so the probably like the wildest feedback that we've gotten so far is that we got an email that was sent to like the general Radiolab inbox, and Sachi, who's our current intern, she checks that inbox and she forwarded it to me one day a couple of weeks ago. And it's an email from a guy who, I'm forgetting his name, but an email from a man who grew up in Clinton or around Clinton. And he wrote us an email saying that he'd listened to the episode and was pretty sure the moment in the story where we arrive at the plot of land that had once belonged to Abraham Neason, the slave owner who my surname is derived from, the three Beckys on the real estate sign moment, he wrote in and said that he's pretty sure he grew up very close to there, and that his cousins are Neesons. And when we were down there that same day, we drove early in the morning, we drove out there, went to that plot of land and spent some time there first. And then there's a nearby road called Neeson Road. And we just drove it, and we were kind of looking at mailboxes, and I don't know what our aim was in doing that, but we were kind of like, we're here. And we had seen months before we got there that there were things in that area named, with this name. There was a church, there was a school, there was a road. And so we just were like, well, we're here, let's just drive around and like see how it feels. We took a little bit of a tangent looking for a graveyard where white Neesons were buried. But we drove up and down Neeson Road for a while, and I remember us looking at mailboxes to see if there were families living on that road with the surname, which we didn't actually find. But when I got this email from this guy, he said that his surname is not Neeson, but his cousins are, and they still live in that area. And he said that he had listened to this episode and was very moved by it and had sent it to them and shared it with them. And I just remember getting that email and like commenting to Sachi, my colleague, wow, and then screenshotting it immediately and sending it to and texting it to Nika. And I haven't actually responded to it yet. I plan to, but I haven't yet. It was really interesting because a question came up while we were working on this. Should we find Neeson descendants and reach out to them? And I was really ambivalent about that. I was sort of like, especially after we got back from the trip and saw just how much documentation this white slave owning family existed for this white slave owning family next to the very scant documentation that existed for my relatives. And I was just like, I'm not really interested in talking to them. I was like, I don't even know what I would talk to them about. There was like a very prominent absence of curiosity in me about them. And so ultimately I didn't reach out. I made no attempts to reach out to descendants of the Neeson family. So it was really sort of surprising to get this email after the fact of someone saying like, hey, this is my family. And he didn't say specifically what information he had, but he was sort of like, I appreciated that he didn't just write an email and dump a bunch of stuff into it, that he asked a question and said, if you're interested in knowing, there's some stuff that I can share, and like reach out to me if you're interested in knowing. And otherwise, I just wanted you to know that I'd heard this and I was very moved by it, and that I sent it to the people who are called Neeson in my family. So obviously I do want to know what he has to say, but like I'm in it now. But I don't know, I guess I haven't figured out quite what I'm going to respond, how I'm going to respond, but I do plan to respond.
Anything else from the panel? Questions, queries, conundrums?
I think you will find more info, hopefully, when you do make that engagement with them. I think it's worth it, to check that out and go down that avenue.
Yeah, I do think it's like now after the fact felt like the moment, I don't know, like coming off of spending time on that particular piece of land. I mean, there were so many other things that were not necessarily relevant to the story we were telling about me and my dad and my grandfather and everyone else in our line, but that felt so characteristic of like Black people taking this journey. Like when we got to Clinton and we're going to the courthouse and actually couldn't find where the entrance for a moment and parked and got out and were greeted first by a big Confederate monument. And then while waiting for Annie she was using the bathroom. There was just some porta potties behind where we were, what we thought was the courthouse. That was actually like where we needed to be. The clerk's office was across the street. We didn't know that. And so we were kind of just walking around and Annie was like, I'm going to go in the bathroom real quick. And Nika and I were standing outside waiting. And immediately the sheriff approached us and basically said, what are you doing?
Right.
There were these moments, and then we walked into the clerk's office and there was that moment on tape where Amanda's kind of like, well, what are you doing? And Amanda turned out to be great, but there were just these like sort of charged moments where we were walking into these spaces and asking the kind of questions that we were asking, and they'd say, well, sure, we've got records. What are you looking for? And like, you guys all know, Nika does not mince words. And so like, we were walking into the space and saying, yeah, we're looking for some slave owners and these small little towns in like rural Louisiana. And they're looking at us and we're looking at them and they're like, I guess it's on the shelf over there. So there were so many moments like that ultimately are not reflected like in the piece, but were so much a part of the reporting trip. And I think explain why when people said, are you going to reach out to Neeson descendants prior to the story coming out, I was just like, actually, no, like, why would I do that? It just felt like, I don't know, pages and pages and pages about these petty fights that were happening inside this family that are not, so much of that, none of that actually made it into the story. These fights that were happening after Abraham.
We didn't get into the got to fighting. Listen, because it was a got to fighting. It was a whole probate packet of got to fighting.
Like faked wills, like siblings fighting.
Right. We didn't talk about how they said they claimed that William Franklin, faked the will, that he faked Abraham Neeson's will. That was a whole episode, was them fighting over the slaves and over the property, and then eventually having to auction and sell everything off. It was, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. And and then when when she found the probate packet and just sat it down in front of us, it's like, hi, you've got 35 minutes to go through about 100 pages.
They were closing in 30 minutes and we were like, okay, well, let's go. So yeah, like, I think all of these other things, the Confederate monument, the sheriff waiting until Annie was away to ask us what we were doing. All of those moments sort of, I think, informed why, to the question of, are you going to reach out to Neeson's now? The answer was definitely no. And after the story comes out and I've had like more time to sit with it, and I don't know, I just was like not interested in putting a spotlight on them. The spotlight had already been on them for a really long time. And it was time to turn it away and look somewhere else. After the fact, though, I do feel like there's much more room for curiosity about what this guy has to say, what he might know, and where it might lead me next.
Mm-hmm. Any other feedback, questions, queries, statements?
What was your father's and aunt's response to your journey? Like, you've gone through this journey and now you have a story to tell. And so how did they respond to it?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I remember the day that the story went live and I was so anxious. I was like a little ball of anxiety. I was just nervous, not about the public response, but about like my family's response. And I was very conscious of the fact that, for a lot of the reporting journey, there was a moment where I started to share things with them before the story came out. But for a long time, I was like very hush hush about it because we were sort of tossing around these ideas about doing like a reveal to my family on tape, where I would gather up everything that we've learned and I would put mics on all of us, and then I would tell them what I had learned. And we wanted to be able to preserve like genuine reactions to that. So there were a few months where I was like not sharing a whole lot. And that was really awkward for me because it was like, I've asked you guys to put mics on and let producers into your house and talk about this stuff really personally. I've told you that I'm going to put it on a radio show that millions of people listen to. And I'm going to work on this for, a year and a half, but not going to share very much with you. It was sort of like an awkward sense of withholding things that did not just belong to me. Once we sort of, the build of the story took a different direction, and we were like, okay, we're not going to do that. And so then I could be much more open. And I talked to my dad the most. I think when it came out, I'm not sure what I was expecting. I think I just was like wanting people to feel fairly represented, I was like worried. I don't know. It's just internally, the way we talked about the episode was, this is like Alex's story. But I was like, this is not just my story, it's my dad's story, and it's all his sister stories, and it's my grandfather's story. Like, it's everybody's story. This does not just belong to me. And so I was just like very concerned with how people would feel having listened to it in general, and also listening to it knowing that many, many more people than just our family were going to hear this, and we're going to think things about it and respond and react to it. So when it actually came out, I was just sort of like waiting by my phone, and I was like scared to call people. Like, nobody actually really said much of anything for like 36 hours. And I was like sick about it. I was like, they hate it. Everybody's mad at me. Like, I got something really wrong. And like, they're just waiting for the moment to figure out who's going to call me and like I was so worried about it. And ultimately, I don't know, like, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who had done a story that was about a trauma in her family for Radiolab before. And I called her and was like, what was it like when you did this? And she was like, it was the same thing. We spend so much time working on a thing, and you have this whole emotional journey, and then the product is done and you put it out. And I think the response from my family, the sort of like prevailing response from my family was like, wow. It was just sort of like of awe, and people were like, that was really cool. And I learned a lot, and I'm glad that you did that. And then that was sort of it. And I was sort of like, everybody was like, well, we got like lives to live. Like, people just went about their business. And it was like, I don't know, I guess that's the best that I could have hoped for, because there's a different response could have been gotten. I did talk to my dad a lot though, about this. I mean, I think for my dad, he was interested in this, but for some reasons that he mentions in the piece, had not had an opportunity to do what I did, which was turn around and look backwards and spend a lot of time looking backwards and digging into the stuff. And I think that for my dad and for his sisters, I think for everyone in my family, all of my elders in my family, I think it's that they looked forward so that I could be in a position to turn around and look backwards and do this work. And so I've come to think of this as like, this is like a role that I was supposed to play in my family. Somebody had to do this, and it wasn't that people didn't care about it. I think it was that people had to survive, and they had to survive so that I could, and they survived, which put me in a position to be able to do this work for everybody. So yeah, I mean, my dad was in the military also. I think he was like especially invested when we found when we found out that Levi had been in the military as well. I think just like these sort of uncanny similarities, like my dad enlisted in New Orleans, so did Levi. I think those like bits of information that sort of make our family story more full and more rich were really meaningful to him. And he's the one that I think the most like asks the most questions. He's the one, like, he wants he wants to make a book of the whole pension file. He was like, I want you to print it out and have it bound.
Why does that totally sound like something that he would do? Okay, so we're going to take each page, we're going to break it up because it's legal size, and then we're going to make it a spread, and then we're going to print it out.
He was like, I don't care. He was like,
Oh
he
my gosh.
wants to have like a physical. I was like, it's a PDF. I have it. I can send it to you. I was like, I'll put it on the drive folder. And he was like, he wants like a physical artifact that can be like held and touched and flipped through and passed on. And I think that's also really important to me. Like, I'm a person, like, he brought a funeral program back for me because he knows that I keep things like that. I keep cards, I keep programs, I keep yearbooks, other people's yearbooks. I got my mom's yearbooks from when she was in school. Like, physical documents are really important to me. And so it was really nice to see him take an interest in that way. And like, for Father's Day this year, I actually, Levi's enlistment paper, that one sheet from inside that first packet that we found of Levi, the piece of paper where Levi drew an X and joined the Union Army. I found a print shop in my neighborhood and went and had like a really nice, high quality copy of it printed so that he could frame it, because my dad also loves to frame absolutely everything. And that was like what I gave him for Father's Day. My dad is notoriously hard to buy gifts for. And I was sort of like every year texting my mom, texting my sister, like, what are we going to do this year? Like, what are you so hard to buy gifts for? And then suddenly I was like, oh, this is actually something that I think is like a heart gift. This is something that is like very meaningful to him. It's something that has become meaningful to me as well. So that's what I ended up giving to him, and he loved it. So yeah, I think like overall, like good response from my family. I think everybody was just really invested in figuring out, like, are we supposed to be Neesons, and I think what this story has done has given all of us permission to let go of the idea that we are supposed to be one thing or the other. Like, we are Neesons because other people, our relatives, our ancestors just took it, they claimed it and exercised agency in doing so. And so who are we to question that?
Any other feedback? I'm glad. I love the Father's Day present. That was good. That was right up the alley. And obviously we have to work on getting the entire 100+ page pension printed in a book. That's the other thing we have to work on. Any other feedback? This has been a great conversation. I'm glad Alex has gotten a chance to just talk
on the floor with out. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the final thing for me is the word anchor. That was the word that put it all together for me, with your family, your dad, with Levi. It just, that word, when it got put in your story, that sums it up. And I feel like you're there now with that, and with your ring. Because that was important to me. And yeah, right. Because I felt heavy when you were in the car with Nika, and you just couldn't describe it, but I could just feel it on her. You were driving, but you were just like you are, Nika, as a teacher. You asked her, in a gentle way, but I mean, I know that feeling. But then when we come back around, and we get to the garden and we find out about Levi, and I won't tell everything, but the word anchor, that is going to stay with me, with you, Alex.
Yeah. And I also just want to take a second and like really, really sing Nika's praises, because this whole experience like was so much like, probably there's a version of the story that could have been done with another genealogist, but the version that we got was so much richer. And it just feels like, I don't know, cosmic luck or something, that I was fully prepared to, like, we call it casting at Radiolab. And I was fully prepared. Like, I'm probably this never happens where you just hit the jackpot on the first person you reach out to when you're looking for a collaborator like this. And like how incredibly lucky and grateful and like blessed I've felt to have sent the email to you first, and for you to have said yes, and then to go on this journey. And Nika is like the most popular person at Radiolab, truly. Everybody who listened to drafts and was sending notes, like people just immediately fell in love with you, and so did I. And the story was so much better and richer for moments like that. I think it's not a trip that I could have done by myself at all. None of the research would have gotten done at all without Nika. And just having like, I don't know, just having like someone to hold my hand through the nerves of doing the family interviews, and through all of the like technical research and reading documents to me out loud when I literally couldn't. And then certainly while we were in New Orleans, just sort of doing that gentle prodding to help me start to process what I was learning. And yeah, that was really special and important to me. And I remember Nika saying to me at some point I think this was before we went down there, that like, this is it, like we're in it. Once this is done, like you can't get rid of me. And like, how lucky am I that that's true?
That is true. I don't think there's like another question in the chat around whether or not Radiolab has done this type of topic before. And I don't think it has.
First time.
All right. Yeah. And I also did not realize how many people listen to Radiolab. I did not know. I was not in the know. Was not like clearly like you heard her just kind of sling the word millions. We have millions. I was like, millions? What millions? Nobody told me this. And I'm over here talking about bunions and whatnot. Either way, right.
The comedic relief was so necessary through so many like heavy moments. Oh my goodness, like you're an angel.
Oh, thank you. It was definitely one of the highlights for me. Not even a question. And for me, the response on my side was, now you're back in radio. That's what I heard was, oh, now you're back in radio, you know, from people that have known me for years, like, oh my gosh, this is like, so this is what you do. And I'm like, yes, and I got somebody else's budget to do it. I didn't have to spend my own money. So yeah, I know I'm a nerd, but oh my gosh. Well, thank you, Alex, for being so gracious with your time. And you know, again, I'm always down for a part 2 or a part 3 because there's still so much left on the table. True's comment around anchoring, I think, is a good one. And that's the thing. It's not so much that we all start with a question. Every single one of us that comes to genealogy and family history starts with a question. That's the motivation. That's what gets us here. You know, all of our why is that. For me, it was just, is there more out there? That was my why. For other branches of my family, it's like, who the hell are you? I'm still trying to figure that out for some people. And the why morphs and it changes and it shifts. And, you know, we were speaking earlier about the fact that what you search for today may not be, the results may not be the same next week or next year, or maybe when you come back to it later. So I really hope that this session today encourages people, just like the episode encouraged people. But I also really want folks to feel sort of galvanized around and validated around their feelings and their emotions about when you take research trips, what happens. You know, having these uncomfortable feelings about interviewing your family members. You know, there are several folks on the panel who are claiming they're introverts, and I'm like, excuse me, when? But right. You know what? Shut up, Andre. Anyway, he's over here claiming he's an introvert. But just that you're breaking through the institutional muck and mire in order to like get answers, and that's not easy. That's not easy. I won't ever claim that it always has been for me. There was a moment and a definitive point in time for me that I distinctly remember when I made a choice that I was no longer going to be a spectator, that I was going to get in the game and I was going to call the plays and I was going to make sure the people ran the routes and went to where they needed to go so that I could get down and score a touchdown. Because otherwise I was going to stay in the stands and have an expectation that the ball would just fly out periodically and I would end up catching it. And so, yes, definitely it's a time. Sometimes it's easier for other people or for people. Sometimes it's not, but make a conscious decision not to be a spectator. And that's what I think this story does, is it says, I'm not a spectator anymore. I'm going to play the game. I'm going to get in and I'm going to try to get answers. And, Levi is the gift that keeps on giving. I think for both of us. In fact, we got another affidavit from another pension file just a couple weeks ago for another veteran. So anywho, yes, I know. Look at True with her little profile pic and stuff. Thank you to those of you all who stayed around on YouTube. Thank you to those of you on Patreon so much for your support, and for our little community there, for just everything that you guys do. Thank you, True, Shelly, Felicia, Andre, Ellen, and of course, Alexandra Neason, for your time and talking about this subject. And we'll be back soon. Ain't gonna tell you when, y'all. You know my schedule is crazy, but be sure if you need to be held over. I'm on a couple. Well, I'm at least on one show right now. If you like home decorating, check out Revealed on HGTV. I'm on a couple episodes there. They usually re-air Who Do You Think You Are 155 times, so you'll see me on that. I don't know why it ends up, and do not watch Tubi, because we had a whole conversation about that earlier. Have a great night, y'all. Thanks for joining us.